And thanks, Mr. Giles, for coming through. Your report on the impact on journalists, section 35P, you've made a couple of recommendations. I just want to, before I go through them, I want to go to scope. Because one of your recommendations is around treating insiders and outsiders separately.
Yes.
And I can see the sense in that. Was the treatment of insiders under this legislation out of scope for you?
It really was. If not formally, the view I took about that was that the whole question of whistleblowing and the treatment of insiders was looked at quite significantly in relation to the amendments to the legislation a year or two ago, where the resolution of it was that there shall be no external whistleblowing, for example, no external material apart from that which goes to the IGIS.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that it was not the time to look at that problem again.
Okay, but we shouldn't consider that in your mind that case is necessarily closed?
No, I simply didn't deal with that issue.
That's valuable to know. So there's no implied endorsement of the status quo as far as insiders?
Not really. It seemed to me, and still does, that a general secrecy provision is appropriate. The open question is how one deals with the whistleblowing situation.
All right. So then to go to your recommendations, you've got two around express harm provisions.
Yes.
Both for the main offence and the aggravated offence.
Yes.
Defence of prior publication, which seems relatively uncontroversial.
Yes.
So my question really goes to whether you believe that simply embedding express harm requirements for the breaches actually allows journalists to do their job. You'd probably be aware there's some commentary in the press subsequent to your publication of this report that this actually doesn't get journalists out of the swamp of not being able to report on these things that they don't even know whether they exist or not.
That's theoretically correct, but it would require any prosecution of a journalist would require proof beyond reasonable doubt of recklessness in relation to, amongst other things, in relation to the harm that might come.
Yeah.
As well as the other elements of the offence. It would have to be an inadvertence would not be good enough, and I think the consequence that does arise is that it would prevent, I accept, journalists from publishing some matter.
How are journalists or their legal advisors meant to weigh those factors up when they won't even know whether they're dealing with a special intelligence operation or not? How do you weigh up recklessness when you're
because
blind?
you weigh up, that will be viewed from what the journalist did.
The journalists won't even know if they've done something necessarily. They won't even, they're blindfolded.
But if they publish with no idea that there's any ASIO involvement, as they could, because it could be a break-in by somebody,
right?
Then they certainly couldn't be prosecuted. The more they know, if they know it's an ASIO operation, the question is how do they resolve that?
Whether it's an SIO or not.
It may not be an SIO.
Yeah.
So they're going to have to deal with how they approach that.
And how do they do that in the absence of that knowledge?
Well, they'll be looking at all that at the moment. One thing I touched on in the course of the report was what would be the consequences of them going to ASIO and saying,
is it or isn't it?
That's right. Now, both the press and ASIO were very reluctant to get involved in any form of clearance, but I think there may be a set of procedures which the press might work out to deal with.
Are you aware, or did you become aware in any of the due diligence that you did in preparing this report of any instances where journalists have either knowingly or unknowingly compromised intelligence operations?
No, there was no example was given to me, and I mentioned that in the report.
So what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Maybe I shouldn't ask you to speak for the government here. Are you satisfied?
On any view, there is the possibility of it occurring.
Yeah.
Is it a... I mean, we don't even know of any instances in relation to the police-controlled operations.
Right. I guess the point that I'm trying to put is that the government's committed to upholding your recommendations in full. We'll
Yes.
wait and see how long that takes, but that commitment's there. We'll take that on face value. The point that I would put to you is that even if that happens, the most likely outcome here is that a story will just be legaled out of existence, and that it would be by far the most appropriate, or not appropriate, but by far the most understandable course of action for a media organisation or a publisher to just play it on the safe side and not publish, which I would put to you is substandard as far as the public interest is concerned.
Possibly, but the other point of view is that you either do or don't accept the need for protection of people and protection of operations. And once you do accept that, then the question is, how do you reconcile those two things?
Well, we're talking about reconciling it in the instance where, and this bill was actually introduced in part to try and prevent what was called, I think in the explanatory memorandum, prevent a Snowden-type situation from arising here, which I thought was an instructive example because Edward Snowden disclosed substantial illegalities on behalf of the agencies that he'd been in contact with and indeed working for. And so
Yes.
you've made the judgment and you've acknowledged, or you've put the position that Section 35P is arguably invalid on the basis that it infringes the constitutional protection of freedom of political communication.
Yes.
I.e. that sometimes it is in the public interest for people to know what's going on inside these agencies. That's why I led those questions initially about insider threat.
It's easy to think of Snowden and so on, but the more instructive thing maybe to think about somebody whose home is broken into by somebody. So we always think in terms of leaks. Now, the secrecy provisions which govern insiders is, as I've said, a separate issue.
Yeah.
The real question is what happens when something external may occur. It doesn't depend upon a leak, but may involve an SIO going badly wrong. And these are the sorts of...
And with that, Mr Giles, no, thank you. And Senator Ludlam, if I could ask you further questions on those, if that's okay. Mr Giles, thank you very much for your attendance.